Ladies and gentlemen, meet Joe Camel, the mascot for Camel cigarettes. For those of you that don't know, he is by far one of the most controversial mascots in marketing history for one reason. He tricked kids into smoking cigarettes. There was loads of proof this was happening, from Camel cigarettes enticing children with toys, to creating a group of cartoon friends in the same fashion as Mickey Mouse, to internal documents from the company revealing top executive plans to market to kids. As a result, the producer of Camel cigarettes, RJ Reynolds, was under fire for years by the US government, all while still promoting cigarettes to kids through their cartoon. There's a lot to unpack with the history of Joe Camel, so what better place to start than his origin in 1913. In 1913, Camel cigarettes were introduced to the world, and of course, they used camels as a part of their first marketing strategy. However, their mascot back then was a lot more tame than Joe Camel. The first Camel mascot they used was pretty bland and went by the name Old Joe. Despite the unexciting appeal, Old Joe sprung Camel cigarettes into popularity and quickly made them one of the most popular cigarette brands in the US. However, by the 1950s, this success wouldn't last long, as other cigarette brands like Marlboro were quickly eating at Camel's market share. How are they doing this? By freshening up their look. In 1954, Marlboro introduced the Marlboro Man, a stunning new brand mascot that made Marlboro cigarettes look cool, way cooler than Camel cigarettes. Over the next decade, Marlboro began to take over while Camel continued to struggle with their old grandfather-like image. Camel knew they needed to make a change to their old look before Marlboro took them down, which takes us to 1974. That year, RJ Reynolds introduced Joe Camel, a much more slick version of Old Joe. The character lacked many typical Camel traits and essentially appeared as a muscular human with a camel's head. This new mascot would replace Old Joe and become Camel cigarettes' new marketing campaign in Europe. Through the 70s and 80s, Joe Camel was featured in magazines, billboards, and more. He was always shown in a variety of fun and entertaining situations with bold and bright colors. He would only wear leather jackets or tuxedos and was usually accompanied by women. Joe Camel was killing it in Europe and selling tons of Camel cigarettes, so RJ Reynolds knew they had to debut him worldwide. So, in the summer of 1988, RJ Reynolds introduced Joe Camel to the US as a part of their 75th anniversary of Camel cigarettes. Doing so, however, would eventually spark one of the biggest controversies in the history of marketing. It's important to note before moving forward the state that the US was in when it came to cigarette advertising. The 50s and 60s were thriving decades for big tobacco, but the 80s and 90s were the polar opposite. More and more studies started to arise during these decades regarding the hazardous effects cigarettes had on humans. It seemed as if every day a new study would link cigarette use to lung cancer or some other disease. With that being said, the US government began cracking down on cigarette advertising to reduce the amount of people considering picking up smoking, especially young people. So when Joe Camel entered the US advertising world in 1988, although it was technically legal to use him in ads, he was immediately under the spotlight from US officials. However, from 1988 through 1990, Joe Camel hadn't had any issues running ads in the US. The cartoon was featured in magazines, on billboards, and more, just as he was in Europe. But people started to question the ethics of Joe Camel in 1991. Many were hypothesizing that RJ Reynolds was intentionally trying to target kids and get them to start smoking Camel cigarettes through Joe Camel's childlike look. As a result, many independent studies tested that theory, and what they found was truly horrifying. One study showed that upon surveying 229 preschoolers, nearly 30% of 3-year-olds and more than 90% of 6-year-olds correctly linked Joe Camel to a cigarette. In another study, young adolescents and adults were tested to see if they could correctly link Joe Camel to Camel cigarettes. It was found that more than 90% of the kids, but only 58% of the adults correctly named the brand associated with the cartoon character. The children also rated the Joe Camel advertisements as much more appealing than every other cigarette brand tested against him. And these studies weren't even the worst of it. Another study found that Joe Camel had become nearly as recognizable to 6-year-olds as Mickey Mouse. This shocking discovery becomes more believable when you realize that Joe Camel also had a group of cartoon friends in the exact same fashion that Mickey Mouse did. While Mickey had friends like Minnie, Pluto, and Goofy, Joe Camel was seen accompanied by his friends, Josephine, Eddie, Floyd, Max, and Buster. The idea that RJ Reynolds was advertising to kids was strengthened even further by a promotion they ran called Camel Cash. Camel Cash was essentially a Camel branded currency that allowed those who purchased Camel cigarettes to earn points, or C-notes. With C-notes, Camel smokers could obtain Joe Camel themed merchandise. The merchandise options included everything from Joe Camel branded t-shirts, baseball caps, watches, inflatable mattresses, and more. The problem was that many of these items and the system of points through which they were earned were especially attractive to young people. These are all items that kids would want, and the only way to get them was to buy Camel cigarettes. With all of this evidence stacking up against them, RJ Reynolds was pressured by the public to end the Joe Camel campaign, but they refused and continued running their ads. However, a bombshell was about to be dropped on them when internal documents of RJ Reynolds' marketing plans from 1974 started to leak to the public. And these documents showed the true colors of the company. Quotes from these plans read such as, "Realistically, if our company is to survive and prosper over the long term, we must get our share of the youth market." Another quote from a top executive read, "In view of the need to reverse the preference for Marlboros among younger smokers, I wonder whether comic strip type copy might get a much higher readership among younger people than any other type of copy." Another document warned, "Evidence is now available to indicate that the 14 to 18-year-old group is an increasing segment of the smoking population. RJ Reynolds must soon establish a successful new brand in this market if our position in the industry is to be maintained over the long term." And another memo read, "To ensure increased and longer term growth for Camel, the brand must increase its share penetration among the 14 through 24 age group, which have a new set of more liberal values and which represent tomorrow's cigarette business." These documents made it clear as day that attracting underage smokers had long been a top corporate objective for RJ Reynolds and Camel cigarettes. With that being said, a fire was ignited within US government officials and politicians. At the time, Representative Henry Waxman compared Joe Camel ads to the moral equivalent of a national campaign to drive drunk, just for the fun of it. President Bill Clinton went on record saying, "We must put tobacco ads like Joe Camel out of our children's reach forever." Parents and anti-smoking groups were furious alike, so the FTC finally stepped in and officially charged RJ Reynolds. While under the spotlight, RJ Reynolds denied Joe Camel was intended to be directed at children. The company maintained that Joe Camel's target audience was 29 through 49-year-old males and current Marlboro smokers. A spokesperson from RJ Reynolds said that, "It's not in our interest to have a campaign that encourages underage people to smoke, because that would greatly increase the chance that the government would step in and restrict our ability to communicate with the adult smoking market." However, it seemed that RJ Reynolds was not confident in that statement. The same year the FTC charged them, RJ Reynolds chose to end the Joe Camel campaign worldwide. The company asserted that the decision was purely strategic and not due to social or political pressure. And from that point on, Camel cigarettes shelved Joe Camel, and in return brought back Old Joe, which can still be seen in Camel advertisements to this day.